Welcome to the Painting Coach, and today I'm proud to say we are painting the Avenging Angel, the brand new Sanguinor model. A huge thank you to Games Workshop for sending me this out early to create the content. So without any further ado, let's fly high and get painting. Now I've primed the model using Retributor Armour Gold spray. If you haven't got this, then you can just use Retributor Armour out of the pot. It's also worth saying as well, I've sprayed this with a brown primer first and then with a gold prime spray. And I find that you just get a better result that way if you're using a metallic primer. It's also really important to give it a really good shake and make sure the can isn't freezing cold. The first thing I'm going to do is add all the shading to the gold, and the colour I'm using for that is Reikland Felshshade. It's really important that you don't let this pool too heavily in the recesses, but you do want to get a nice all-over coat, and because it's going over a nice glossy finish, it should flow really nicely. When that's completely dry, we can start to highlight the gold back up, starting with, of course, Retributor Armour. And generally, you're going to paint fairly large areas of the model with this. Now, the box art is done in a non-metallic metal style. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to do it in a true metallic style. But I am going to use some of the highlights on the box art to guide me, even though I'm painting with the metallics, not actually in a non-metallic style. Just work your way around the model, highlighting all of those surfaces that are facing upwards. Next up, we'll carry on those highlights using Liberator Gold, again focusing on the areas that are facing upwards are going to catch the most light. Now, this is a little bit of a jump in value in terms of the brightness, so make sure you've got some thin Retributor Armour on hand. So if it does go on a little bit too thick, you can always use that just to dial it back down a little bit and just blend those highlights in slightly. Again, I'm following the box art for the highlights, even though I'm painting in a slightly different style. The last highlight is going to be with white gold from Pro Acryl. Now, I'm going to use this very, very sparingly, and this is where I'm going to start to do more of an edge highlighting style, looking to catch those sharp edges all over the model, even some of those that are in shadow. Again, if you're not sure, check the box art and just have a look at where some of those highlights are and mimic them using this much brighter colour. If you haven't got white gold from Pro Acryl, you can use a very bright silver and mix a tiny bit of that into your Liberator Gold, and that will hopefully give you the same effect. I'll paint all of the silver next, and the colour I'm going to use for this is dark aluminium from Vallejo. Now, there's not a huge amount of silver on the model. We've generally got the iron halo, we've got the chalice, and we've got the hilt of the sword as well, and some little parts of the jetpack if you want to pick those out as well. I'm going to wash all of the silver using Dark Tone from Army Painter. Now, this gives a little bit of a glossy finish, and I'm okay with that because I'm using it on a metallic colour. If you haven't got this, Null Oil is absolutely fine. The one thing to make sure of is that you don't spill it over any of the gold that you may have already finished. I'll then take some chrome from Vallejo Model Air. If you haven't got this, you can use something like Runefang Steel. And all I'm going to do is drag this along the sharp edges to get nice, crisp highlights. I'm also going to feather it down that chalice, so I've got a nice little bit of a reflection on there as well, and you can see that in the next couple of stages. I'm now going to block in the shoulder pad inserts using Mephiston Red. Don't go too wild with this because there's not huge amounts of it that you need to use. Just make sure you've got a nice even coverage across everything. We'll then start to build the brightness of that red using Evil Sunz Scarlet, and I'm generally painting all of the shoulder pad insert with this colour, just leaving the Mephiston Red up against the gold so it's a little bit darker. I'll start to work a little bit of Wild Rider Red into the centre of the shoulder pads as well now. I'm not using a huge amount of this, I'm using it fairly sparingly, and I'm keeping that Evil Sunz Scarlet on hand as well. So if it does go a little bit too far and starts to look orange, I can always just bring it back a little bit. Lastly, I'll put a nice crisp highlight in using Fire Dragon Bright. I'm not using a huge amount of this, and you can bypass this step if you want to. I'm just drawing a nice sharp line along the edge of the insert so you'll get some high contrast against the shoulder pad trim. We'll paint all the parchment next using Rakarth Flesh, and you can see one of the problems of using a metallic primer. It can be a little hydrophobic, which means the paint beads up and doesn't stick to it. Now, one way you can get around this is by popping a shade over it so it mats it down a little bit, or just let that first really blotchy layer dry and then go back in and build it up. Now, I had to use 2 or 3 layers to get a really nice even coverage of Rakarth Flesh across the model. When that was completely dry, I then put some gloss varnish across the prominent areas of the parchment. Now, you might be thinking I've lost my marbles, but I haven't. I decided to use some Space Marine decals to actually get some nice insignia on some of the parchment to save me having to freehand paint it. And that was a Really easy thing to do. I just use some of the Blood Angels transfer sheets, some really old Blood Angels transfer sheets. I think the Blood Drops are from Imperial Knight transfer sheets, and some of the other elements are from the Indomitus and Leviathan box sets as well. Once they were completely dry, I did leave them overnight. I then took some Agrax Earthshade and washed this all over the parchment areas. And don't forget, it's not just the parchment holding up the Sanguinor. There's also the scrollwork on his shoulder pad and also the purity seal on his right leg. Now, the key with this Agrax Earthshade is to spread it out so that it doesn't pull too heavily in one spot. When that was dry, it's time to get highlighting, and the first colour is Rakarth Flesh. Now, what I want to do is maintain the aged look of this parchment, so all I'm going to do is paint horizontal lines very randomly across this, just building up that texture. So you'll see I'm starting to leave darker colours in some of the recesses. I'm dragging the brush to catch the edges, and that's just give me a nice effect that you can get through quite quickly. I'll then take a 50-50 mix of Pallid Wych Flesh and Rakarth Flesh and do exactly the same thing, painting horizontal lines across the parchment. Again, this is just going to help build up that texture. I'm being careful around those decals as well, not to accidentally paint them, and this is going quite quickly. I'll add a bit of pure Pallid Wych Flesh just in those areas that are going to catch the most light, such as the parts that flare out on the back, but I am going to use this fairly sparingly. And it's worth saying, whilst I'm doing these highlights, I'm highlighting the purity seal and also the shoulder pad scroll as well. So you can see here I've done a lot of writing and text on the scrollwork. This is my secret weapon for that. It is a micron pen. It's a 0.05 size nib, which I'm guessing is 0.5 millimeter thick. It's very small. And all you do is just take your time and write some squiggly lines across all of the parchment, and it gives you a really nice, easy text effect. Now, you can do this with a brush and really thin paint. I find I've just got a lot more control using the pen. I'll take some Screamer Pink to paint the wax on the purity seal and the handle on that sword. Once that's completely dry, I'll take a little bit of the dark tone, again from the Army Painter. Again, if you haven't got this, use Nuln Oil, and just paint this over those same areas. I'll then highlight them back up using Screamer Pink, leaving the darker colours in the recesses. And I will finally use some Pink Horror just to draw some nice tight lines across the handle grip and also pick out the lumpy parts of the wax of the purity seal. This will give me a nice simple highlight. It's time to block in all of the lighter areas now, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Corax White. So in terms of the things I'm looking to paint, it's all of the wing iconography like we've got across the midsection and the shoulder pad. It's the blade of the sword. It's all of the gems across the model as well, and also the blood inside that chalice. I'll then take some Apothecary White contrast paint and use this to shade the wing elements. So we've got those wings on the midsection, the shoulder pad, and of course on the hilt of the sword. When that's completely dry, I'll take a really bright white. I'm going to take AK White, and I'm going to drag this along all of the wing elements to get some nice crisp highlights. It's worth saying at this point I've painted the majority of that bottle on his waist with the AK White as well, building it up to a nice even coat. So carry on highlighting all of the white, dragging the brush where you can. Make sure you haven't got too much on your tip, otherwise you will spill it into the recesses. I also highlighted all of the blood drops with this as well. Now the power sword itself is a slightly off-white colour, so I'm going to base this using some Blue Horror. Now the Blue Horror, once you thin it down, is very thin, so you just need to put 2 coats on so you get a nice even coverage. You're not really going to be able to notice it, but it does really help us when we come to painting the sword later on. For all of the blood drops, I took some Blood Angels Red contrast paint and painted this very carefully over them so I didn't spill it onto any of the gold or the white elements. Take your time with this and make sure you haven't got too much on your brush. When it was dry, I went in and added more Blood Angels Red contrast paint towards the bottom of the blood drop, or those areas that are going to be in shadow. I then started to highlight the blood drops using some Wild Rider Red. Again, just some nice thin lines going from top to bottom, drawing a J shape. Inside that J shape, I used some of the Fire Dragon Bright, very thin tip on my brush, not much paint, and just try to get inside the Wild Rider Red from the last stage. To finish off the gems, I took a very small amount of AK White and just tried to put 2 dots towards the top left-hand side of them. If you want to add some extra shine, you can always gloss varnish the gems. Next, I based all of the black elements. I did this using AK Black. If you haven't got AK Black, you can use Abaddon Black. The biggest caveat of all goes for this section. Be very careful about spilling it on parts you've already finished. To highlight the black, I use some Eshin Grey to start with. Now, generally, you can drag your brush along all of these areas because you've got nice bits of rigidity across either the leather on the belt or the rubber of the undersuit. I finished this up using some Dawnstone, again with a nice thin highlight by dragging the tip of the brush across the sharp areas. Really important that you don't put too much on your brush and you try to get it inside that Eshin Grey. If you do make any mistakes, you can go back in and just tidy up. Now, for the bottle, I took some Aethermatic Blue contrast paint and painted it over the white part as well as the red part. Once it's dry, put a second coat on. For the power sword, this is fairly straightforward, but you may take a couple of goes to get it right. So all I did was pop some Aethermatic Blue contrast paint onto the blade where I wanted it to be darker. I then cleaned my brush and dipped it in some contrast medium, not a huge amount, and just feathered the edge so it blended out nicely. Now, if you've not done this before, it might take you a little bit of time to practice, but I will show you how to fix some of the bigger mistakes later on as well. So I plotted out across the sword where I wanted the darker elements, and like I said, just use a little bit of contrast medium to feather it out and get some nice blends. This isn't going to win you any golden demons, it's not crispy smooth, but it does sell the effect on the power sword. If you need to go back in and correct anything, then take some blue horror, thin it down quite a lot so it's a glaze consistency, and then you can just glaze it over those areas where you want to feather and smooth out that transition a little bit. Now, you need to be patient with this. It's not like you're applying a layer paint, so you do have to take your time. But if you do make any mistakes, you can always just go back in and add some more Aethermatic Blue if you need to. To finish up the sword, I took some AK White and dragged my brush along the edge to get a nice crisp, bright highlight. I also dragged it up the middle of the power sword. This is quite tricky. You need to be fairly smooth with it, otherwise you will end up blotching it, but it does give you a nice effect. I also used it to highlight the power node. For the bottle on the waist, the first thing I did was use some blue horror to highlight it up. Again, I was just stippling where I think the light is going to reflect off this. And once I'd finished with the blue horror, I added some AK White on top of it. For the blood, I stippled some Evil Sunz Scarlet so it gave a bubbling effect. And then I mixed some white in with this to get a nice pink colour, and I use that to continue the lighter highlight from the blue part of the bottle down over the red area. For the wings, I left these off the model and primed them with white Scar. Any white primer should be okay. And to get them shaded, I took some Pylar Glacier and painted this into the recesses. I then took some contrast medium while that was still wet and used it to feather out across the wing. This is a nice, easy, straightforward effect that gets you a nice sort of bluey tint to the wings, which I think was a little bit nicer than just the grey tint that you get on the box art. Of course, I did this for both wings, both sides, and just one tip here is to be very careful about how it dries, because if you leave the wing at an angle to dry, all that paint will run towards the end. I then went back in with some AK White to highlight up the wings, and that gave me a really nice bluey glow effect coming through the underside of all those feathers. And there we have it, the Sanguinor is done and ready for the tabletop. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave me a like and a comment down below. This was a little bit of a longer one, but the model is spectacular and full of detail. So I hope we've given you some tips and tricks to actually get some of the more complex elements done without too much hassle. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.